Today it's my delight to be here on stage with Holly Throsby and Julie Janson. Before I introduce them to you, you know what the housekeeping notes are. You've got your phones, you're tweeting or Instagramming madly, but you're doing that on silent. And you're using the hashtag @WordsOnTheWaves. Holly Throsby, to my very left, is a musician and novelist, and she'll be well known to you. Her best-selling novels have been shortlisted for many awards, including the Barbara Jeffress Award, the Australian Book Industry Awards, and the Ned Kelly Awards. Holly's latest novel is Clarke, which you can see there. Welcome to you, Holly.
Thank you for having me.
Julie Janson is a Burruberongal woman of the Darug Aboriginal Nation. She's a poet, a novelist, and a playwright. Her novel Benevolence was shortlisted for the Barbara Jeffress Award and longlisted for the Mark and Yvette Moran Nib Literary Award. Her latest novel, which you can see here, Madukka, the River Serpent, has just been longlisted for the Miles Franklin Literary Award, which deserves a clap in itself, I think. Congratulations and welcome to you, Julie.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
So today we're talking about something quite close to my heart as a writer, secrets. And in particular today we're talking about secrets held within small towns. Julie, Madukka is set in 2020 in the town of Wilga. Now I've not heard of Wilga. Is that a real town?
I can't say that. Wilga is a town of my imagination, but based on a long experience of travelling along the Darling River. Before I actually speak, I'd just like to say I acknowledge I'm on the land of the Awakabal, Guringai and Darkinjin people, and I acknowledge also Aunty Di is here today, which is a pleasure to have you here, and my mum too, Joan, sitting up the back there. So. This is an amalgam of towns. I lived in a town along the Darling River when I was very young. I was a first-year out teacher, and I spent most of my time there, and it was Burke, but town is not Burke. But please, believe me, it wasn't. And I spent a lot of time down on the Aboriginal Reserve. And in that particular time, nearly every day I'd go down there and push my pram. I had a 3-wheeled pram, and I'd push it from town down to the reserve, and I would stay all day with my friend Aunty Jenny Ebsworth, and I'd help Jenny drag water out of the river, and we'd wash clothes and nappies and things and boil up the water in a big tin next to her house, which was an extremely small little house made out of tin that came from the tip. And that particular reserve had over 300 people living there. They had 1 tap and 2 toilets. So that was the beginning of me beginning to be fascinated by the river and the Nyempa and the Gamilaroi people who lived along that river. And subsequently, many, many years later, I've written this story, Madukka, the River Serpent. That's a long answer to the question.
No, it's a good answer, thank you. Holly, your novel's set in the town of Clarke, which is described as a big town that feels like a little town. Tell me about Clarke.
Yes, Clarke is as well a fictional town. It's situated within this fictional region that I kind of thought up because my first novel was called Goodwood, which was the name of a little tiny kind of more idyllic town in the south coast region of New South Wales. My second book was set in a town called Cedar Valley, which is mentioned a lot in Goodwood, and then the town of Clarke is mentioned in both of these books, the first 2 books, as being the kind of, commercial centre where everyone from the little towns goes and does their big weekly shop or goes to the RTA. And it's described variously, depending on who's talking, as somewhere which is like so convenient and has everything you could possibly want, or just completely devoid of any character and extremely boring. I don't have an opinion either way as to what Clarke is, but the characters in this book kind of do. And the town is large. I mean, the book is largely set in the Clarke Plaza, which is the shopping centre, which will be familiar to anyone who's ever been to a regional town shopping centre. This particular town is kind of a little bit based on Nowra. It's kind of a little bit Lismore. It's a little bit Maitland. It's just a little bit of these towns that I've spent a lot of time in. I mashed them up and I created Clarke. And there we are.
So as you've said, Holly, your books, Cedar Valley, Goodwood and Clarke, all revolve around a similar area. And in fact, we have characters that return, even just slightly. Was that deliberate to make a trilogy of these books, or is it something different?
It wasn't deliberate when I started writing Goodwood. I just really wanted to flesh out the town of Goodwood and situate it within a greater landscape to make the thing feel more real. And so when I was writing that, I could really imagine the other towns and how they connected to it. And I could imagine the people that lived in these different towns. And when I started my second book, I thought, well, I've already got this other town waiting for me that I've sort of mentioned. And I had a couple of characters that I already knew were kind of around that town. And then when my third book came along, Clarke seemed to be the obvious choice, even though it's a different town to write because it doesn't have that same kind of the character that Goodwood has in terms of what I think a lot of people kind of want to imagine a small town is like. There's more of a kind of critique of regional Australia in this book and kind of colonial Australia. But it wasn't really a plan. It's more I work very instinctually, so I kind of knew that I had somewhere to go. And the main character in this book, Leonie Wallace, she's mentioned in one paragraph in Cedar Valley. She's a witness in that book, and all we know about her is that she works at the Harvey World Travel in the Clarke Plaza, and she has a tendency to over-cater for events. So I took those two little nuggets of information about her, and she becomes the main character in this book, and that's just like a nice challenge for me.
And for those of you who have read Clarke, you'd know that those points about Leonie are really most of what you need to know. She works in Harvey World and she over-caters, and it says a lot about who she is, and we'll find a bit more about that later. Julie, to you, within Wilga there's an array of characters, but the star of the show is definitely Aunty June. If Aunty June were to join us here now, describe her for me. How would she be? How would she look?
Well, she's most probably here, sitting up the back somewhere. Aunty June is a matriarch of her family. She's in her 50s. She's a very good-looking Aboriginal woman of Gamilaroi descent, and she's the centre of her small family. She lives with her brother William and her sister-in-law Merle and her niece Arana, and they live in Wilga some of the time, and the family also lives sometimes in Redfern. But Aunty June decided to do a TAFE course in investigative services. It's a Cert 3. If you want to do it, you can actually do it. You can do it online. It costs $120, and it's only 30 hours, all right? And she did that course, and she got her private investigator. You know, she's now a real PI. This is a true thing. You can all do this. And she decided she'd set up an investigation services in the town of Wilga. So she rented the local ex-video shop, and people were still dropping videos down the slot several years later, and the last one was Midnight Cowboy. And so Aunty June puts a sign up in the window, says Yanakiri Investigation Services, confidentiality guaranteed. And she's got lots of clients, and they're all Aboriginal women trying to chase men who've run off without paying child support. And anyway, and the thing is, she doesn't get paid at all. They pay her absolutely nothing, but occasionally they'll come down and give her a kangaroo leg. And she sticks that in the fridge, and every time she opens the fridge to get some milk for her tea, the blood drips onto the floor. So that's our Aunty June. And
Julie, just staying with you for a moment. When conversation turns to sex, Aunty June says, I might be 50 up here, but I'm 15 down there. Was it liberating to write about a woman who so openly celebrates her sexuality?
Well, she's an Aboriginal woman, and anyone, any of the Koris in the audience will know that Aboriginal women have a very wicked sense of humour, which they don't often share with others because it can be seen as a little bit too outrageous and a bit of a free idea about relationships. I made Aunty June a single woman so she could have a lot of fun. I'm not saying that married women don't have fun too. I'm sure we do in our own quiet way. But Aunty June would look out the window and she'd see a couple of young blokes digging the road and she'd go, oh, he's all right, you know. And they'd say, Aunty June, really, at your age, you say, oh, it's all right, he looks good. But my book's actually an incredibly serious book, so.
Yes. Well, sex can be a serious business.
It's just there to make sure people keep turning the pages.
Holly, a lot of your novel takes place in one street in Clarke, and we meet several people living along that street, most notably Leonie, Barney and Dorry. And for those of you who have read Holly's work, you know that she brings you into her world. It's very intimate writing, and you feel as though you've met these people, and in fact, when you leave them, you feel slightly bereft that you won't be spending time with them again. So, noting that, Holly, tell us a little bit about Leonie, first of all.
Sure. I think Leonie would probably apply for the TAFE course if she'd have known that existed. Also, just quietly considering doing that myself. Leonie's a very kind of big-hearted person. And I think that her kind of energy is something that really generates so much warmth in the book. And we find Leonie living with a 4-year-old boy called Joe, and we very quickly discover in the first pages that Joe is not Leonie's son. And so there is a few different mysteries running through this book. Ostensibly the book is about the disappearance of Leonie's next-door neighbour, Ginny Lawson, who disappeared several years earlier. Leonie has done her best to rally for a police investigation, and in the same way that Aunty June, investigates, she does her own kind of investigation as well. And the whole thing is turns out to be not really a police procedural, although the police do show up, but more of a neighbourhood watch procedural between Leonie and Barney, who lives next door in the house that Ginny did live in, and Dorry, who lives across the street, who's Leonie's best friend. But the mysteries of the book are like, who is Joe's mother, for example, and Barney, this next door neighbour who's been living in Ginny's house for only about 6 months, has a wedding ring on his finger, but there's no sign of his wife. So there's a few missing women sort of haunting the book. And Leonie, I think, is someone who is quite emotionally repressed. Her and Barney are both in a state of immense grief when we find them. And, as well, this is a serious book as well, although there is a lot of humour in it, and a lot of it is provided by Leonie. But I think, like a lot of us, using humour as a way to cope with the world, she does that very well. And it was nice to write a book which focused on this sort of relationship friendship really, between two older people who are brought together by proximity and by this event of the police showing up on the first page of this book, with a search warrant to find Ginny's body, and how that connects Leonie and Barney and Dorry, and I guess her the way that she loves quite fiercely and the way that she brings Joe through the world is, it was a real pleasure to write her.
I think it was interesting that you introduced us to Leonie and Joe, and my assumption was that, yes, this was his mother. And you say that we quickly find out that that's not the case, but not immediately. Was that deliberate as well, to show that families come in different measure and assumptions are made and the love is similar?
I think, without sort of being too political about it, I do feel that a lot of my books do tend to celebrate non-traditional family structures. In this book, she's obviously, Joe is not Leonie's son, and I'm interested. I'm a queer person, and I gave birth to one of my daughters. My partner gave birth to our other daughter. It's really interesting to navigate those things and to navigate people's assumptions around what that connection is between mother and child, around biology or not biology. And for me, it is something that I think people have a traditional opinion about, and it's always nice to show various different examples of how a person can be parented, and how it doesn't really matter, if that person is their mother or not.
I would say that might strike a chord with you too, Julie. And in Wilga, you introduce us to a community of people who are interlinked and who have relationships that are closer than their blood links might show. Early on we meet Tomo, who is June's cousin. He's an activist and one of her favourite people, and I really liked him and I was really looking forward to getting to know him. Instead, he disappears. Tell me how Tomo came to be part of that novel.
Well, I wrote this novel based on a play that I wrote years ago called Gungies, which means the police. And I thought, there's a play that's gone to waste. It was only on once at Belvoir Street Theatre and 3 people came to see it. So I thought I'd reprise those characters. And I was reading a book about how to write a crime novel, because normally I write historical novels, and I thought I'd better read up on it. And it said you start with a body. And I thought, okay, a body. I look at the family that I really love, June's family. I think, I can't kill any of them. I'll invent someone new and I'll kill them instead. So yes, we start with a disappearance, and that's where Tomo came from. But rewriting from a play was actually a real advantage, because I already had a really clear idea of that family, and that family's kind of been with me for years. The funny thing about being a novelist, we were talking about it earlier in the green room, you spend a lot of time alone in your slippers in a darkened room in front of a screen. Whereas when you're a playwright, you're out there in the theatre, in the foyer, surrounded by handsome actors in leather jackets, and everyone's really sexy. And when you're a novelist, you spend years alone in a dark room on antidepressants. So,
Holly, would you like to comment on that?
I think there's a lot of truth being spoken at this session.
I want to go back to Dory. Now, Dory's one of my favourite characters. If I were to wake up on that street in Clarke, what would I see when I greeted Dory?
Dory is the neighbour that lives across the road from Leonie, and she's Leonie's best friend. And again, described as a much older woman than Leonie. I think she fulfills a kind of maternal role for reasons that we kind of find out. Again, I like having, friendships and these kind of relationships with people that seem somehow unlikely. But she's a retired psychologist. At one point, she's a really good cook. She, at one point, is described as looking like she just elegantly milked a cow. She sort of has a farmy kind of vibe. But I feel like, for me, a lot of the books have relationships between women and friendships between women. In this book, Leonie also meets a friend of her sister's who she sort of has a new kind of burgeoning friendship with. And to me, it's a really nice way to write. This whole book is written in what I discovered is called the close third person. I'm always late to these terms because you kind of write a book and then you're told what style you wrote it in. But it follows Leonie and Barney, and we know which perspective we're getting quite clearly. But I sort of enjoy writing in that way because everything in this book, there's not really any backstory. It's a show not tell is another literary term that a teacher told me about when she came to my event. And I enjoyed writing that. It's very different from my first book, which is just full of kind of long digressions. I mean, this book is very much told, almost, more like a play, I guess, where all the information is transmitted through these interactions between characters. And I think also setting it back in 1991, where people did have a lot more face-to-face interaction, and also in a smaller town where there's a lot of face-to-face interaction, it's just a really nice way of telling intimate stories and having conversation between two people really speak the story to the reader. And I'm a big fan of that, that I think it was John Steinbeck who said, don't show me what a person looks like, show me what they say, and I'll kind of imagine that for myself. And I think in this book, the turns of phrase that you get between Leonie and Dory were some of the most enjoyable parts to write, as were the parts between Leonie and Joe. Writing dialogue for a 4-year-old is an adorable experience.
You're nodding, Julie. Dialogue is a big thing in Madukka as well. And of course, does that come from your experience as a playwright, or is it something you gravitate to?
It definitely comes from my experience as a playwright. I think dialogue is absolutely integral to a good novel. And and when my early publishing experiences, I was told to cut out a lot of the dialogue. I said, you can do whatever you like, but do not touch my dialogue. It really brings the characters to life, and I appreciate this is what Holly likes to do as well. I was interested in Holly's talking about the politics in a way behind some of the ways that she writes, and I think for me and many writers, often you have a very strong political kind of point of view, and certainly for Madukka, the River Serpent, I talk about it sometimes in this sort of amusing kind of way, but at its heart, the story, it's a crime novel, but the crime is the death of the Darling River. That's the crime that I write about in this novel. It's actually a novel about environmental destruction and corporate greed and colonialism and the impact on not only Aboriginal people, but every person who has a little farm along the Darling River and tries to grow oranges, or every single human being who lives along that river is impacted by the greed, corporate greed of the farmers further up north, which are great big international corporations supported by people like Barnaby Joyce. So, look, you know, sorry to bring you all down, but with humour sometimes and a sensitivity towards characters and dialogue, you can evoke characters that actually also carry quite a political message, because otherwise I don't think I would bother to write. The politics for me is actually really important.
And of course, the politics can be so despairing or so depressing that in order for a book to work for perhaps even a mainstream audience, you need to have something propelling you forward and actually keeping hope. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and perhaps that's why Julie turned to crime. I mean, I think that the usefulness of crime is often that the pages keep on turning, right? Like, you have this really strong kind of narrative trope, which can be familiar. I'd love to read the How to Write a Crime book that you read, because I feel like I need some pointers myself. But I do think that using genre in a way, like in a playful way, can be really fun. Like, I enjoyed using the structure of a crime novel in all three of my books, but really writing books, a lot of them don't have any crime whatsoever, but it's an interesting way to kind of set up a story and to have characters interact in a way that readers kind of expect in a way, but then subvert that to create surprise and to create kind of novelty, I guess, within that genre. Like, my books don't sit in the crime section of any bookshop because they're not kind of crime books in inverted commas, but I do get to do a lot of crime panels, and I really enjoy reading crime fiction. And I think what it does is, you know, if you're trying to say anything, it's always kind of nice to seed it within a structure that you can kind of work with and then play with. I think as a novelist that can be a really kind of creative exercise in itself.
I'm on the board of the Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival, and my interest in that was the breadth that crime can be. I was less interested in hard-boiled stuff. I have some background as a criminal lawyer. And so for me, I thought, well, there's nothing to narrow down what crime means, particularly for writers and for readers. With that in mind, Julie, what do you see a crime to be or a crime book to be?
Well, I've used both, the crime against the river and the complicity of sometimes town councils or even complicit sometimes Aboriginal leaders who are complicit in some way by receiving some kind of payment, or, you know, everybody's complicit in those crimes. And I think it was when I was researching this novel, I went along the Darling River with Michael. We drove along the Darling River, as we did many times, in 2020, and the river was completely gone in Wilcannia. There was no Darling River. And we stood in the... so this was the crime. We stood in the dust of where the river had been, and there was just a big green slimy hole with some dead kangaroos around it. And then we went to the local shop to buy some water to drink, and the water was $6.95 for a 2-litre bottle of black and yellow water, right? And I went back to the car and I said to Michael, how does someone living in this town, an old lady on a pension, afford to drink water? If she needs 2 of these bottles a day, you do the maths. She can't afford to drink. You turn the tap on and it's bright yellow kind of sulfuric acid kind of bore water. How does a woman with a newborn baby bathe that baby? And I got incredibly angry. And it's, you know, the politics was stark to me that as a human being, I'm not going to go and tie myself to, a pump that's pumping water out. I'm a bit old for that, but I can write. So I decided that the crime for me was the crime against the river. But I do like the crime genre. I like reading crime. I read them for entertainment, It must be say something terrible about us that we actually read crime books to actually amuse us. But it's a great genre to get a story across. And you get to invent fabulous characters like, the bad bikies, Bam Bam and his friend Cowboy. And you can have a lot of fun writing crime.
Holly, you can see how passionate Julie became when she talked about the anger that provoked her and that gave, partly inspiration for this book. What is it that inspired you to write Clarke?
The book is loosely based on the disappearance and then murder of Lynette Sims, who was previously known as Lynette Dawson, because I, literally 30 million other Australians listen to the Teacher's Pet podcast. It had 30 million downloads. I guess that was multiple episodes because that's more than our population. But I do feel that, it's interesting when you say crime for entertainment. That's why Netflix has a new true crime series every kind of week, it seems. I went through a period of being really obsessed with true crime podcasts. It started to really infiltrate into my psyche, and now I don't listen to them anymore because I realised that kind of everything's diet, right? Whatever you put in is kind of part of your kind of world diet, and I think the amount of true crime podcasts that I was listening to was really affecting me. But at the time, I did listen to that podcast, and I was really interested specifically in the point of then following up with newspaper articles and being obsessed with that case. When the police finally showed up to dig for Lynette Sims's body at that house in Bayview, the people that were living in the house didn't actually realise they were living in that house. So that was the real part of that case that made me think, wow, imagine how that would feel if the police showed up at your door and you're living in this house and you had no idea that there was potentially a body buried in the backyard, and how would that kind of make you feel? So that was really the point of interest that came to me on a real human level, because I was thinking, well, what would I do? And then I had this idea of Barney, this character in the book, and Barney's an academic. He's really into bushwalking. He's kind of a dilettante. He's very knowledgeable. And it's 1991, so what would he do? Well, I guess he'd go to the library because he'd have to look at the microfilm because he'd never heard of this case really, or it was in the back of his mind, and how would he react? So that was on a purely human level. That was a really interesting point to start a book. For me. But as I went into it, the thing about when you listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, and a lot of them are about murders and a lot of them about women who have been murdered by men, one does start to become a little angry about how common it is for the police not to do anything about that. And especially if a woman is, marginalised in any way, if she's pretty and white, that's one thing. But Lynette Sims, she was even pretty and white, So the more you get down the realms of a person being, in any way queer or Indigenous or a person of colour, the police just don't do anything. And I think time and time again we get this story told to us of people that knew the person who's missing or been killed, trying to get justice, and nothing happens. So it was an interesting and extremely sad kind of realisation that this case is just like every other case. This is more famous probably because she is white and she was in an affluent suburb, but it wasn't famous until it became a podcast. Before that, the police still just believed the guy, And so I guess that kind of started to be, it's almost like in every story about a woman, and there was a lot of anger that I was feeling. And I read some, Jess Hill's See What You Made Me Do, books about domestic violence and things like that. I think these days we're at a point now where there has been a little bit of change around coercive control and things like that, but it's realising how sadly familiar these things are is certainly sobering.
For those of you who weren't amongst the 30 million who downloaded The Teacher's Pet, Holly's explained it a bit. So Chris Dawson was a teacher in the northern suburbs, I think, of Sydney, or Northern Beaches, And he was married to a woman who disappeared, and he quickly started a relationship with a former student or even a current student. And some years ago, and only recently has he been convicted of his wife's murder some 30 years later. With that as an aside, Holly, this Dawson case has only really just resolved, if that's what you call it, at least in terms of the conviction, recently, and yet your book is goes back to 1991. Why make that decision rather than have it contemporary?
Just because it's not that case. You know, like it was generated by a seed of an idea around that case, but it's not that case, and it very quickly becomes not that case. And I can have my own ending because it isn't that case, you know, and that was quite liberating. I think, you know, there's a lot of books that are kind of loosely based on fact. This one is to the point where I did acknowledge it in the acknowledgement because it is an active kind of case, and I'm aware that her family is alive and well, and I wouldn't want to disrespect her memory in any way, but I really hope that I didn't, because the character in this book that is extremely loosely based on her is by all means, you know, a lovely woman. And the reason being that my books exist within that time space, and it was interesting to, this one's set slightly before Goodwood and Cedar Valley, so people who, you know, a guy who dies in Goodwood is alive and well in Clarke. And again, that was kind of fun to write. That's what I believe in popular culture is called an Easter egg for readers of the genre.
Julie, Holly said of her books, they're kind of anti-crime novels, with the setup of a crime novel that then subvert those expectations. Does that ring a bell with you?
Well, I had no idea how to write a crime novel. I read the book. I just looked at a few tropes. A trope is what's supposed to happen in a crime novel or in any type of literature, really, and kind of tried to follow that. I've written about police in this novel, and some people have assumed that, you know, I'm somehow anti-police. I've got a cousin who was in the police force, a terrific young man. I mean, you know, police are great. You know, your house gets robbed, you ring the police and they come. But I did find that I had characters in my novel who were less concerned about investigating the disappearance of a young Aboriginal man, for example. And this happens every day in country towns in Australia. Aboriginal men particularly, but women as well, are often treated in a different way to other people. And in fact, 30% of the people in prisons tend to be Aboriginal, and yet they're only 3% of the population. So these kind of things did form on my mind when I was writing, but I try to write all characters with a heart, and even my police officer, Sergeant Blackett, plays the organ at the church on the weekends. He writes poems that are published in the Wilga Gazette, and he's dreaming of retiring to Woy Woy, of all places. So I try to give a heart to even characters that are deeply morally flawed and possibly, very, very bad at their hearts, but try to give an understanding that they're complex characters. So if it's an anti-crime novel in that way, I'm guilty of that. I just like to write complex and interesting characters, but I did my best.
Is Clarke also an anti-crime novel?
I don't know. I mean, it kind of is in the sense that, I guess a crime novel you imagine to be like a police procedural or something. And there's a certain kind of way that characters move about that is sort of expected, like if you're going very genre about it. But for me, some of my favourite crime books would be like In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. It's like a great crime book, or No Country for Old Men by Cormac McCarthy, which are books that, you could say they're crime books, but they're obviously literary fiction. I think that, again, I really resonate with what Julie was saying there around characters. I mean, I certainly as well have very little sort of judgment, I think, around characters. I think all the characters need to be much like people here. I don't really believe in there being like a bad person. And so that idea in crime books that there is a kind of fight between good and evil, I mean, it's certainly not that book, and I would never write that book. And I think one of the things one of the main things that come out of Clarke is a feeling of like a celebration in a quiet way of kindness between people, and the way that these people relate to each other, and the way that you can kind of get that from these relationships between how they become connected and how they kind of navigate through these kind of quiet, everyday acts of kindness between people ends up kind of coming up. And I didn't intend that to be the case, but I did an interview with a woman in Melbourne who said that after she finished Clarke, she went and gave some jam to her neighbour. I thought that was like the best review I'd ever gotten.
Julie, is kindness important in your writing?
Well, just listening to Holly then too, I was thinking about, I've got a couple of characters in my novel who are bikies. And the first time I ever met a real bikie, he came to my house in Balmain when I was a very young woman, single woman at the time. He came to a party with 3 other bikies at the door, and they were Comancheros, I think. Huge guys with great big beards and covered in kind of chains. And I just stood terrified at the door, and someone at the party said, "Let them in, they're going to come in anyway." And so this big bloke came in, and he stood in the kitchen where, of course, I was washing up at my own party, as you do when you're a woman. And he came into the kitchen and said, "Have you got any chamomile tea?" And I said nervously, yes. And he said, "Yeah, but have you got any honey?" So I made him a cup of chamomile tea with honey. He washed the cup up and dried it, dried my dishes on the sink, said thanks very much for a nice night, and left. And after that I thought, well, maybe I've got to rethink about bikies, you know. Maybe they're actually underneath are really nice people. And I subsequently met quite a few in the country town Michael and I live in. And we have complex feelings about those bikies in some ways. The bikie is the guy you want to come in and kill the black snake in your kitchen, right? With a gun. But he's not the guy you want to cross in any way whatsoever if you're a woman, because he might just beat you up and kill you. So that juxtaposition of those two sides of human beings I find fascinating. And sometimes I'd go for a swim in the river, and Michael and I'd go down to the river, and sometimes you'd go in naked. But this day, no. There were 30 bikies having a meeting, a chapter meeting down by the river, and they were turning some animal on a spit, kind of looked like a dog, but I guess it was a pig. And they're sitting there in their white underpants at 9 o'clock in the morning with beers on the... morning, you say nervously as you go past. And so I realised that bikies have this kind of complex tribal kind of situation. And some of them do things like bikies delivering presents to the hospital at Christmas. And you think, well, actually, there's quite a complex array of moralities involved with being a bikie. They're also dealing the methamphetamines from our country town over to Canberra at the same time. So I like to explore. Ever since that time in my town, when I see any of these people, I nervously hope they haven't read my book.
Julie said, "An artist without politics is a warrior without a spear." Holly, do you agree with that? Do you want to read it again?
I heard you. Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I feel like I'm not going to write like a sort of book that feels didactic, you know, and I feel like, I mean, I don't think Julie does either, but I do think that and I don't think anyone wants to read a book where they feel something's getting shoved down their throat, or they feel like getting sort of lectured by a novelist. Like, I don't want that. But I do feel like the authorial voice does convey a certain worldview, and certainly a view of human nature, for example, that I think you can glean from reading a certain author's work. So if I think of authors that I really love, or authors that kind of irk me, a lot of the time it'll be because of a kind of subtle view about human nature or about the world that sits just behind the book and gives you a sense of whether you'd want to have dinner with that person or not, you know. And so in that way, I think that, you know, I don't want to be cliched, but I do think that the personal is political in that way. And I do believe that it comes through, whether you need it or not. Like, I don't know. I'm sure that some writers churn out books with quite an apolitical viewpoint. But I do think if you looked at the finest, books, your favourite books, they're probably from an author who has extremely strong convictions.
And I'll come to you, Julie, but I think too, writing a novel takes time and you have to stick at it. So you have to be interested in it. And often the interest is an emotion that's been provoked, whether it's political or whether it's something difficult to understand. So tell me about that statement that an artist without politics is a warrior without a spear.
I grew up in a home in Boronia Park, and Mum's here, she'll testify to that. Mum was the one who always took me to the library, and my brothers. She'd go up to Gladesville and push a pram full of books all the way down, and without her I wouldn't have learned to write. Mum was also a writer as well, and learned to read. But my father was very passionate about politics. He was of Aboriginal descent, and they were members of the Communist Party, although Mum said she used to like to go to the Communist Party meetings because they had such lovely parties. The politics was always on the table all the time, and Mum, being English, would say, "Can't we just have a nice dinner?" But Dad was always about discussing the revolution, what was happening in Russia, and right from a really early age we were kind of taught to speak up and have an opinion, which is a wonderful thing for families to do. And you were allowed to have your own opinion about things, and you would have to learn to argue and become quite a good debater to defend that opinion. So I think, I've always been a bit opinionated, but writing does give away. But I agree with Holly, you can't write a didactic book, you're going to bore everybody to tears. So it's finding the artistry and the creativity and the humanity in characters that creates you as a writer. So it's not about the politics, it's actually about the sense of humanity.
Just a quick aside to the audience, we're going to take questions in about 5 minutes, so have them ready for us. I'd like to turn a bit to the craft of writing. Holly, you've said it's not until the third or fourth draft that your characters become more and more dimensional, until they become wholly their own person, and I consider how they'd act themselves. Tell me about that process of getting from first to fourth.
Yeah, my first drafts are pretty kind of monochrome. Like I do think that the first draft is sort of it's like you telling yourself the story. And so you have to sort of work out how the narrative pieces all fit together, and that's a big challenge. In terms of where you're saying what keeps it interesting, a lot of the time you've got characters that you find interesting, you've got a storyline that you find interesting, but then also working out how to make it feel narratively satisfying for readers is like the most enormous challenge. Like how is this outcome and gonna feel like people haven't wasted their time basically reading this book? And it's interesting because readers have a lot of opinions, readers have a lot of needs. And that's different from the audience that you might have as a musician. If you write songs, there's really no narrative, there doesn't need to be any kind of resolution, narratively speaking, in a song. In fact, a song can make absolutely no sense lyrically and people will still potentially love it. You learn quite quickly as a novelist that readers have expectations and that you need to kind of work out how to make that all kind of, it's like a puzzle to get it all to work together. And so for me, the first draft, as I was saying, we were talking about this earlier, it's in the green room, it's excruciatingly difficult, I find, that bit, and I get it out at little tiny chunks at a time. Of the amount of words that I could write in a day it's usually quite small. But then, as I get to, once that's all set out and I know how it all looks, I go back in the second and third draft and I just add heaps of colour. And that's the bit that I find very pleasurable. It's not nearly as excruciating and it's a lot more fun to kind of go back, and now that you've worked out how the characters have done that, you know them more and you can go and give them, you can adjust their dialogue to make it suit them more profoundly, or you can adjust what they're wearing, you can adjust their interests, or you can fill out the room that they're in. And I find that bit, when you start to go and add all the colour, to be really exciting. I look much more forward to going to my desk in the morning when I have the first draft done and I can go and do that.
Julie, does that resonate with you? What do you think of a first draft?
Oh, dreadful. It's called the vomit draft, really. Shocking. It's awful and painful and exhilarating because you can write whatever you like and nobody cares. And you know, it's very freeing. But I absolutely agree with Holly. As you do each draft, and who knows, we do, 10 drafts of a novel. They're so long. God, they're long. And but when you're getting right to the end, I call it the weaving process, where you begin to weave back both colour, but also you begin to weave characters back into the story that maybe you've only used at the beginning a little. And you think, oh, hold on, this character can have another role. Like my young police officer who's a Constable, what's his name? Constable Johnson. I decide that he has a love interest, and I weave him into the black and white ball, the debutante ball, awkwardly sitting at the back, and no one will dance with him because he's a police officer. You know, and to do the colour of weaving the characters back and forward in the novel is a great pleasure. Or suddenly deciding to put in a scene that's completely ridiculous. You know, a whole lot of people digging up a body all together, you know, a town councillor, you know, a bikie, you know, the most obscure people, and just stick them on the edge of the grave and give them all a shovel and see how they work together and what they say to each other. So that's the great pleasure, is towards the end of a novel when it all begins to really gel and cook. Yeah, I agree.
Just as a last question, I was interested in what Holly said about readers' expectations. And it seems to me now with internet, with social media, with emails, that there's a much more intimate relationship between readers and writers. I've just published a kids' book called Running with Ivan, and I've had children write to me with suggestions for a sequel, which wasn't a bad suggestion, actually. So my question is, do you find that intimacy with readers something that's noticeably increased over your writing careers?
I don't think I've done it for long enough to notice an increase in that regard. When I wrote my first book, it was published in 2016. I don't think anything's really particularly changed in the social media landscape, for example, in that time. But I will say that readers, you know, can be blunt. Or it's always nice. I think when people take the time to actually write you an email or a message to say they really liked your book, it really makes your day. And it's really encouraged me. Like, I now write to authors a lot now, because if something's really sung to me, I think, well, I enjoy getting that feedback, and it's just a nice way to brighten someone's morning. But I do think that feedback from readers has been extremely instructive to me. If people criticise something that I think about your own work, that you kind of just don't agree with, it's kind of easy to be like, well, I just disagree. I mean, it's such a subjective thing. Like, I can press into the hands of my best friend my favourite novel in the world, and they can be like, yeah, I just didn't really like it. And so I think we all need to understand as writers that not everybody's going to like your book. I mean, that would just be impossible. But there are some things that readers have sort of fed back to me that have really hit and kind of stung, because you'd think, shit, I kind of knew that was a bit off about whatever it was. And it could be a tiny detail, but you'll think, next book, whatever that thing that you might have done is, you kind of won't do it again. And in a way, readers, I think feel invested, and rightly so. I mean, fiction's one of those things where readers are quite active, and that's why I think crime, again, is it's a good genre, because a lot of crime readers are reading and also actively guessing and working it out and going to sleep and wondering how it's going to work out, or having theories. And that's a really nice way to kind of actively participate in what you're reading, as opposed to sort of just sitting back and letting it wash over you. I think crime readers can often be a more active reader within fiction, and I welcome that. Like, I welcome people having theories and finishing the book and then saying, and what do you think happened next, or what do you think this person ended up doing? And that's a nice way to continue a relationship between these fictional characters that kind of live on in the world in people's imaginations.
Julie?
I think about that word about intimacy with a reader. It's sometimes... I also get messages from readers sometimes, and I always reply, because I'm flattered at the attention. But sometimes the attention is not that great. When I moved to this little country town with Michael a few years ago, I walked into the local pub, a small pub, small number of people, about 20 people there, and the publican reached from, he said to everyone as I walked in, he said, everybody, someone new in town, it's Julie Janson, she writes the dirty books. And I was like, pardon? And he said, I read that book, The Crocodile Hotel, and it's full of sex. And I said, well, no, it's about land rights. He said, not the page I read. So you have to be careful to... And after that, when I walked into the pub, I kind of sat in the corner looking vaguely embarrassed with my glass of Chardonnay, hoping that people had read the subsequent books.
Although I suspect there may have been a spike in sales after that. I'm going to turn to questions. Could you please put your hand up, and I think there'll be a roving mic which will come to find you. Anybody questions? Thank you.
Thank you all for a wonderful presentation. Holly, I was wondering, you've written 3 books and I don't have any of them. In which order would you read them?
All of the books are completely standalone books. You don't need to read them in any order, or you don't need to have read one to read another. And that was kind of really how I wanted it. So start with this one if you want, because hopefully it's my best. You don't want to get worse, you know.
I have a question for both of you. How do you switch your mind off to go to sleep at night? Are you developing the characters all night, or how does that work for you?
It's an interesting question. They do follow you around a bit, your characters. But as I said, in those lonely days, they're the only friends you've got, you know. No, it's all right. I sleep okay. I tend to worry more about more earthly things than the characters.
Yeah, I don't necessarily, it's more to me how to figure out where it's going, like what I'm going to do next in the first draft. That really sits with me. Much like if I'm writing a song, the melody just goes around in your head. So you're often, and I always find that you get your best results away from the laptop, you know, because I wish that I wrote on an old-fashioned typewriter, but I write on a laptop. When I go away from the computer and I'm, you know, going for a walk or driving or riding my bike, it always fits into place in those ways. I think, you know, there's lots of books about creativity. They'll all tell you the same thing. That just often happens. I think the mind sort of goes to a more relaxed place and things work themselves out. If you try too hard, you're probably going to go down the wrong road.
That's definitely true. But also a word of warning for the budding writers in the room. If you're feeling that an idea comes to you in the middle of the night and it's 2 o'clock in the morning, do not get out of bed. You'll sit there and for 3 hours later, you're sitting in front of the computer and your partner comes out and you're looking completely harrowed and you're a mess for the rest of the day. And if you keep doing that, you actually go a little bit mad. I mean, I'm seriously saying you have to look after your mental health if you're going to write something long. Be careful.
Although on the positive side, I think that if you go to bed with a problem that needs to be resolved in a novel or an issue that's raised with a character, often it can resolve itself by morning. It's something with the brain that works when it's more relaxed, I think, as you were saying, where perhaps not 2 o'clock, but hopefully after a decent sleep. Another question.
Thanks, ladies. I have really enjoyed this morning's session, so thank you very much. My favourite movies and my favourite books are where the author or the filmmaker lets me do a lot of the work. You know, I get very frustrated when I'm given everything. Do you ladies consciously leave gaps for us readers to do some work?
I certainly do, and that's something, especially in my second book, some readers didn't like that, that I was potentially asking readers to do more work than some readers wanted to do. I completely agree, and I really like to have a lot of imaginative space, and I'm much more into sort of suggestion than everything being neatly tied up in a bow at the end. In fact, I was reading a book by Kent Haruf, who I really like, who's an American writer who I was quite inspired by. All of his books are set in the same fictional town of Holt, Colorado, and they all kind of interconnect. He writes beautiful books, and he wrote this beautiful book that I loved, and then at the end it had this chapter that was like 2-page chapter, which everyone kind of lived happily ever after, and it kind of gave you this nice, like they were all having dinner together. I kind of felt like, did the publisher get him to tack that on because the book it was sort of too left unresolved, and that chapter just irritated me so much I wanted to rip the pages out. Like, I feel like and in this book, in Clarke, I feel like there is, there's a really good amount of resolution. But there's also, you need to sort of think, well, then what? And I feel like what I was saying before, the idea that the characters kind of continue on, I think is really important. You don't really want them to just go away and not to be thought of again. And so, yeah, I think what you leave out is really important, especially around description, around how much you do describe and how much you leave out. Like, I feel like I'm very interested in giving just a couple of sentences to generate an entire room that people are sitting in, because I think if you can nail the couple of details that evoke enough in a reader, then that is enough. Because, I think Elmore Leonard has that, he's got his 10 rules for good writing, and one is if there's parts that a reader's going to skip over, take those parts out. So I always skip over long descriptive passages, so I just take them out of my own books.
Thank you.
Julie, did you want to? So one more question that we've got time for. Who's going to be the lucky person? But for those who wanted to ask a question, didn't quite make it, Julie and Holly will be signing their books at the bookshop. So please come and join us there and say hi. Yes.
Thank you. Holly actually kind of touched on the question I was going to ask about closure. At what point do you have a sense of closure, or do you ever have a sense of closure from the books and the characters that you write, or do they, I suppose, live on and evolve on?
Julie, did you want to try to approach that?
Yeah, I think Aunty June's going to live on. She's got more environmental crimes to solve. I think she's going to go up to the Adani mine next and take that on. I think they do live on. I balk at it because my natural feeling is to write historical novels, and the novel I've just finished is called Compassion, which is a follow-up to Benevolence, which is about the history of the Hawkesbury River, really, and going up to Newcastle, and in fact this place again here, looking across Lion Island and to the northern beaches, features once again in my new novel. So yeah, and there's similar characters that were in Benevolence. So yeah, sometimes characters get right into your head and you haven't quite finished with them. So yeah, I agree. Sometimes it's nice to carry them on and you get to know them very well.
I saw there was one hand, I think the gentleman in the second row, and I think we've got 2 minutes. Is that a quick question? Excellent. If we could pass the mic down. Thank you.
I was once given a piece of advice that in writing between drafts to put it away and don't touch it, and I found that when I go back and I'm constantly fiddling, I can get myself into a mess. Do you have a practice between drafts of sticking something under the pillow, having a sabbatical, a hiatus, or whatever you...
Yeah, absolutely. When I was trying to write my first novel, I also read a How Do You Write a Novel book by Stephen King called On Writing, which is a really helpful book if anyone wants to write a novel. His practical advice is, write 1,000 words and put it in a drawer and don't look at it for, I can't remember what the time frame was. Was it a week? Was it a month? I think anything that can give you some perspective and fresh eyes on your own work is incredibly valuable, whether that's a period of time, which I think is really important between drafts, but also printing stuff out, like not reading stuff back from a screen. If you print stuff out onto paper, you really do process it in a different way, and stuff that you might not have noticed will stand out. Change the font into a font that you would never use, because it's very unfamiliar and it doesn't look like your own writing coming back at you. I think there's a lot of things that you can do to create distance, and as long as you can get that and kind of try and read something as if you haven't written it yourself, then your edit's going to be a lot better.
And a good editor, if you can afford an editor. I mean, really, when I was making absolutely no money out of writing, I'd still find $3,000 to give to a good editor. It nearly kills you, of course, not to mention killing your husband when he sees the bill. But actually, they're absolutely essential, a good editor, and they're unheralded in many ways, but editors are like gold.
I can second that, third that. We've come to the end of our time, so thank you very much. I think I'll hand back to Benny and hopefully see you at the signing desk.
Thank you very much. What an amazing panel. Julie, Julie, I think the Central Coast will suddenly be full of a lot of us investigating, creating a lot of middle-aged women looking after each other.
Can I just say one word? I really want to thank all of the organisers for this festival. I've seen it grow over the years, and it's absolutely fantastic. And the wonderful volunteers. I think we really should give them a look.
Thank you. Thank you. Please thank Suzanne, Julie and Holly again. Thank you so much. Buy their books, they're amazing.